I was born into a family that could be called a real family, except that today I have a completely different idea of what this word means. My parents are the kind of people who are firmly established in the world of decency, where every gesture and word, every movement in life were subject to strict rules of respectability. They lived by a set of impeccable standards, which they called the norm. Everything had to be in its place: clothes, behavior, and even conversations. We, their children, like everyone in our environment, had to follow these invisible directives, build our lives in strict accordance with their unshakable rules. My sister Emma was the perfect embodiment of their dream of a perfect child. She knew how to play this role flawlessly, always knowing what to say and how to get up at the right moment. Emma always wore the right clothes, dated boys from the right families and, as if by magic, became the perfect reflection of their expectations. Mom and Dad were proud of her successes, tirelessly emphasizing how she excellently performs her role in this theatrical production of their lives. They organized church meetings, charity events, where every step, every word was checked in advance and corresponded to their views on the world. But behind all these performances, behind this public show, there was another, less attractive reality that I couldn't help but be disappointed in. Our house was like a theater, where Mom and Dad played the main roles, portraying an exemplary family for the whole district. In public, they were unshakable pillars of society, Father with a perfectly tied tie, and Mother with her carefully selected outfits for every church event. They attended every important event, made charitable donations, and were always in the spotlight, showing everyone how to be virtuous and caring. However, when the public's eyes turned away, when the door closed behind the last guest, the masks fell off. And the house turned into a gossip room, a room in which the truth was hidden, not intended for prying eyes. Mom's friends often came for coffee, and that's when the real show started. Mom would start to stir up conversations with caustic irony, as if casually stirring her coffee, and behind her back I would hear these malicious comments about people whom they, so skillfully pretending to be kind, actually despised. "Look at the horrors on these Hendersons," she said, "and it's in the church. It's all just an exhibition. Look at their daughter in these shorts. She could use a little modesty." Dad did not lag behind, nodding and adding fuel to the fire. His sarcastic remarks about other people's cars, houses, quarries were imbued with fake concern, which, as a rule, hid hidden criticism. Special attention has always been paid to Aunt Claire, my father's sister. She was everything they weren't, and I always liked that. Aunt Claire was an actress. She had real success on the stage, and her life, like her work, did not fit into the strict framework established in our house. Dad would have supported any beautiful thing Aunt Claire brought, as if they were infinitely grateful for her existence. Of course, they couldn't help but admire her ability to maintain her career, her independence, but they never missed an opportunity to give injections about how she manages money. If only she could afford something better, Dad repeated with a malicious grin, glancing at another gift from his aunt. And indeed, despite her theatrical fame, she spent all this theatrical luxury on herself. They discussed how much she earns from her shows, how her wealth should allow her to dress differently, but, in their opinion, she continued to bring cheap gifts, thus setting a bad example to her relatives. And yet Aunt Claire continued to be their target for condemnation. She preferred her career to her family, and in their opinion, this was the biggest flaw. I remember when I was 7 when everything changed. It was one of those ordinary days when Mom would have another tea with her friends. Her circle of loyal gossips had gathered in the living room again, and as always, I was playing in a corner, sitting on the floor and fiddling with dolls. They were still discussing Aunt Claire, but this time the words sounded different. Mom, with that whisper she used for the most disgusting comments, said, "She's just a slutty woman," and her every word was sharpened with contempt. I sat there, frozen with the doll in my hands, and felt this conversation penetrate my soul, although I could barely understand its full meaning. Their reactions, slight shocked sounds, nodding their heads, as if they were enjoying it all. I had never heard those words in such a tone, and it was new and terrible for me. I couldn't understand why it bothered me so much, why every word they uttered touched me deeper than I could comprehend. I've heard them talk about Aunt Claire many times, but it all sounded different at that moment. A few weeks later, when Aunt Claire next came, I felt that something in her behavior had changed. She was helping me reach the cookie jar on the top shelf, as always, but this time I think I said something I shouldn't have said. "What a slutty woman, that's what Mom and her friends call you when you're not here," I blurted out, and at that moment I noticed how her face changed. I saw her hands tremble as she carefully put the jar back in place, and her gaze became so sharp, as if she was trying not to let her emotions get the better of her. I didn't know exactly what had happened, but something in her reaction suggested that my words had touched her sore spot. It was more than just surprise, it was anger, it was a deep wound that I unwittingly opened. "Jessie, honey, you stay right," she said softly, her voice trembling like never before. And then I felt the air in the room change. It wasn't just an argument between adults. That was the moment when Aunt Claire made it clear to me that she had been patient and silent for a long time, but something in this house had crossed the line. She entered the living room where my parents were sitting, and I followed her unnoticed, standing in the doorway. I knew I couldn't avoid this collision. "I've endured a lot from you, too," she continued, addressing my parents. Her voice was trembling, full of hidden pain and rage that she could no longer contain. "I ignored your snide comments, your constant judgments, your criticism of my life choices, but this is too much. It's calling me names behind my back." I was studying programs in college and my dad laughed when he heard about my plans. He was sure that Richard, the son of an old family friend, was the perfect candidate to continue his father's business. Dad always knew that for a man to succeed, he needed a supportive wife, not a career, and that women should not get too carried away with their ambitions. It was, as always, his idea of how life works, and I knew it was important to him that I make the right choice. They made an appointment with Richard, and as expected, he turned out to be exactly what I had always imagined, right, boring and absolutely not suitable for me. But when I saw the looks of my parents, when they exchanged signs of approval, I realized that they would not leave this. My own desires and doubts didn't matter to them. I smiled and agreed to date him. It wasn't for me, of course, but I found a way to do everything right for them, while not forgetting about myself. I secretly applied for a college scholarship, and soon this little trick became my salvation. Graduation day started like a dream. I had achieved the maximum scholarship that one could only dream of in class, and although my parents did not know about it yet, I felt that I had the opportunity to start my life with a clean slate. In the evening, after the ceremony, we went to a party at Richard's house, where most of our class gathered. The music was blaring, people were dancing and laughing, and everything seemed so perfect that I almost forgot about my inner emptiness. But it was at that moment that everything collapsed. I went upstairs to use the bathroom. The door to one of the rooms was ajar, and I entered without a second thought. What I saw took me by surprise: Richard and my friend Kelly, both in bed. My graduation, my life, my perfect picture were destroyed in an instant. The cap I was holding slipped out and fell to the floor with a thud. This caused both of them to raise their heads. Richard tried to cover himself, but I didn't say a word. I just stood there, frozen, before saying softly, "We're done." It was calm, too calm, and maybe that's why I surprised myself. I left the house and didn't look back. My phone immediately started buzzing with messages and calls. Richard, Kelly, they all tried to reach me, but I ignored them. I knew the storm would break when my parents found out. The next morning, Mom couldn't stand it. She screamed when I refused to explain my little mistake. "Are you serious?" she asked, as if she didn't understand what he was talking about at all. "He was in bed with your girlfriend. How can you do that?" Her words sounded like a sentence, but I felt that it was all much deeper than just resentment against Richard. Dad, who was usually so strict, tried to find an excuse. "Well, you know, Jess, men, they have needs. A good wife should sometimes be able to look the other way." I couldn't believe my ears. It was so humiliating, so deceitful, that I just wanted to leave this house and never come back. But that was not the case. Mom continued, her voice now icy like never before. "Do you want to embarrass our family?" Are you going to put our dirty laundry on public display? All this spread through the room like a stench, and I realized that neither an explanation nor an excuse would save me. All they could think about was how it would affect them, their social status. And then I couldn't stand it. Something in me that I had been trying to ignore all these years suddenly snapped. Are you talking about shame? I laughed. What's really important to you, Mom? Just what other people will think. You're sitting here in your perfect home and judging everyone who doesn't meet your standards, but in fact you're just a hypocrite. Mom, caught off guard, took a step forward, her face turned white, and she froze. Her icy voice became even more stern. You're going to apologize to Richard and to Kelly, she said with such a look that I knew nothing would change. I haven't spoken to her for many years, although I've been saving her number all this time. But then, at the most difficult moment, when the world turned upside down and everything around lost its meaning, I called her. On the third ring, she answered. I couldn't find the words, but her voice immediately eased my anxiety. Hi, Jessie, she said, and there was something familiar in her tone that calmed me down. Then there was a pause, and her voice became soft, almost velvety. Honey, what's wrong? I told her everything. About how Richard betrayed me with Kelly. About how my parents reacted, how I was kicked out, and how I lost everything that was so carefully planned. The words came out between sobs, and I didn't even realize that I had been holding back all this time. When I finished, there was silence on the phone. Where are you now? She asked, and I stood outside Richard's house and replied that I just couldn't leave without saying goodbye. Stay there, she said. I'll come get you. It was about an hour's drive, but her words left no doubt. An hour later, her red convertible pulled to the curb and she jumped out, hugging me tightly, not caring that my tears had left traces on her silk blouse. I didn't care. At that moment, I felt supported not just by a relative, but by a man who once lived the same way as me, opposing his family and the world. Aunt Claire's house in the next town was as bright and welcoming as she was. It was different from our sterile, cold house, in which I always felt out of place. The walls were hung with posters of theatrical productions, and the smell of freedom was in the air. My aunt took me to the guest room, where, on an old but comfortable sofa, I felt for the first time that I could be myself. This is your place now, as long as you need it, she said. And it was not just a room for the night, it was a place where I could relax, where I was accepted unconditionally. That evening, over a cup of hot chocolate with extra marshmallows, I told her the whole story. She listened to me without interrupting, nodding only occasionally, and I could feel her passing every word through herself. When I finished, my aunt smiled. Do you know what you remind me of? She said. You remind me of when I was your age, when I stood up to them, choosing my own path. I'm proud of you, Jessie. She paused, and then, laughing, added, Really, you don't think I'm selfish? I looked at her, not understanding what she meant. She continued, Selfish? Are you serious? Honey, don't live by someone else's script. Don't be selfless, don't be a puppet. You need to write your own story. Her words sounded like a revelation. I felt that I had finally found the person who could understand me without judgment. The weeks remaining before I started college were some of the best in my life. Aunt Claire helped me set up my laptop, taught me how to search for freelance writing assignments on the internet, saying that these days, everyone needs content. Why not make some money while you're waiting for the start of your studies? She suggested. That's how I started writing articles about everything from pet care to travel advice. In the evenings, we spent time watching old musicals or reading scripts. My aunt told me stories about her theater days, and I listened to her as if they were not just memories, but a living part of her life. For the first time in my life, I felt that I could be myself, without fear or regard for the opinions of others. When it was time to go to college, Aunt Claire personally drove me. She helped carry all my boxes, her caring hands held my things, as if with their help she was passing me a piece of her world. After graduation, I accepted a senior position at Aunt Claire's company. It was natural, considering how close we had become over the years, that I couldn't imagine living anywhere else. The company was great, my career was rapidly gaining momentum, and most importantly, I spent almost every weekend with Aunt Claire. We became not just relatives, but also friends, partners in life, supporting each other at every step. Sunday classes with my aunt have become our tradition. She told me stories about her latest theater projects, about directing, and how she passes on her passion and knowledge to new generations of actors and directors in her theater. Sometimes we spent whole weekends watching old movies or trying to recreate the bizarre recipes we saw on cooking shows. It was the time that I valued the most. However, one day, at the moment when I already felt that her energy knew no barriers, my aunt told me on Sunday morning, "I know I don't have much time left." Her hands, clutching the coffee mug, trembled, as did her voice as she softly uttered these words. She didn't do it to arouse pity, rather, so that I would understand the importance of every moment. I took her words into my heart. She said she had a few months left, maybe less. I moved in with her that day to be near her. My job now was not only to perform professional duties, but also to take care of her. The days merged into one whole. They were no longer divided into working hours and personal time. We made the most of every moment, doing what an ordinary family could do: cooking, watching movies, discussing life. She insisted on teaching me her secret recipes, told me stories about her youth, and insisted that I promise to continue living bravely without turning off the path. But one morning, on Tuesday, when I was already used to being around, my aunt quietly left. Her departure was so gentle that I couldn't believe in reality. She slipped away, holding my hand, as if she was passing me something important that was supposed to become a part of me. The theater community gathered us at her funeral: actors, directors, students from her workshops. The church was packed with people whose lives she had touched, but the 3 empty seats in the front row spoke volumes about those who had stayed away. My parents and sister were not among them. I didn't come. Although I sent the information about her death a week later, I knew that I would not be able to be a part of that official ceremony. My place was with my aunt, not with those who could never understand how important this woman was to me. The morning after the funeral, the notary summoned me to his office. "Your aunt spoke in great detail about her wishes," he said, pushing the documents across the table. "The house, her land in your hometown, her savings are about $700,000. It's all coming for you." I sat there stunned, and tears rolled down my cheeks. It was too much, too sudden. All I wanted was to give my aunt back her energy, to bring back the days when we cooked together. A few days later, while sorting through her things in her home office, I came across an old stack of letters. They were all addressed to my father, but none of them were sent. With trembling hands, I opened the most recent one. The letter said, "Dear John, I know we haven't spoken in years. The doctors say that I don't have much time left, and I find myself thinking about family, reconciliation. Remember when we were kids and you used yourself to protect me from the neighborhood bullies? I've missed you, John. Let it be as it should be, but I wish we could talk." My heart sank. It was a letter that did not reach the addressee, which remained hidden, like all the unspeakable pain of my aunt, which I may never know about. 2 years after Aunt Claire's death, I still lived in her house, which has now become my home. This old, cozy corner was full of memories that I couldn't throw away, and I spent every day trying to justify her trust, deciding how to live on. Work in the company was going uphill. Promotion to senior manager brought me a corner office and a salary that would make my young figure brighter in the eyes of everyone who did not know what was behind the success. Day after day, I immersed myself in my work, trying to forget that there was no one else who could support me like Aunt Claire. Then one day the phone rang. Mom's number flashed on the screen, and I froze, watching the numbers. My hand instinctively reached for the reject button, but I don't know what made me answer. Mom's voice was quieter than I remembered, with a hint of fatigue that permeated every word. "We need to see each other, can you come?" That same weekend, I found myself in front of my childhood home. The building, which once seemed sturdy and well-maintained, now looked abandoned. The picture in front of me was frightening: the once shining facade, now covered with peeling paint, gutters that sagged, a perfect lawn, once snow-white, now overgrown with weeds. It was a place full of childhood memories, but now it was no longer a symbol of family well-being. It was even worse inside. The furniture was worn out, the carpets were worn to holes, and in the corners sat my mother, looking older than a year ago. Her face reflected years of struggle, and gray curled tightly in her hair. Dad was sitting next to me, his face was hidden, and I immediately noticed defeat written on his features. Emma curled up on the couch, her 3 children snuggled up to her, and I saw a bruise in her eyes, hidden by poorly applied makeup. There was something inexpressible in her gaze. "I have nowhere else to go," she whispered, not looking me in the eye. I felt her words pierce me, the irony was unbearable. Jason, their perfect son, the one they once saw as a model for Emma, showed his true face. He was aggressive and rude, leaving only destruction in his wake. Jessica's mom, her voice trembled as she spoke. "We were wrong. We forced you to be with Richard. It was our mistake. It was all a mistake." Tears began to gather in her eyes. "We tried to force you to choose the path that we thought was right. We tried to control your fate." Dad nodded, but there was pain in his eyes. He was trying to admit a mistake that, as it turned out, led to their collapse. "We shouldn't have forced you," he said softly. "Look at what our precious reputation has led to. Everything is falling apart. I can barely keep the lights on." My mother continued to tell me how my father's business fell apart, how their friends abandoned them when hard times came. When there were no more glints of wealth on their faces, everyone turned away. Hell, they couldn't even afford to fix a leaky roof. My heart sank at this admission, and I immediately, without hesitation, wrote them a check for $10,000 for repairs. "No strings attached," I added. "Everything you need to get the house back in order." From that moment on, I started visiting my parents regularly. I brought food, clothes for children, new equipment when the old one broke down. My parents were grateful, perhaps sincerely, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling of inner tension. Something about these visits remained inexpressibly cold, even when they tried to be grateful. One night, sitting in my apartment, I noticed a photo of Aunt Claire standing on a shelf next to my things. I felt her absence again, like a heavy burden that I can neither shake off nor forget. The sincere gratitude from my parents gradually turned into something else that I could not immediately realize. At first they sincerely thanked me for everything I brought, groceries, clothes, money to the accounts, but soon the tone of their words changed. Instead of gratitude, I began to hear imaginary requests, covered with politeness. "Oh, we were hoping for a different brand," Mom said, looking at the next box of groceries I brought. Or, "We really need something else." Her gaze was strained, but as if she didn't dare to speak directly. Then I began to notice that these requests turned into direct demands. Mom no longer called with shopping lists, she formulated them as questions that were actually expected answers. "We need a new washing machine, the one at Sears is for sale. Can you pick her up this weekend?" she asked in such a tone that I couldn't refuse. And a couple of days later, Dad joined in, saying that, "Your sister's children need new school clothes, good things, not cheap things from a discount store." I began to feel this anxiety gradually turning into something more, into expectations, and not only about things. Their every wish became urgent, as if I was obligated to meet their needs. The requests became more and more absurd. Mom said they urgently needed a new TV because the old one was not smart enough. Dad asked when I was going to fix the backyard, because the counters in the kitchen were annoyingly outdated. Each of their demands seemed more and more ridiculous to me, and I couldn't figure out where the moment was when my good deeds began to be taken for granted. I was still trying to stay sincere, but soon the requests became so frequent that I began to get tired of the constant responsibility. And so, on the eve of their 35th wedding anniversary, Mom called and said that they needed a new car, and not just a car, but a decent one, for $6,000. I almost dropped my coffee cup when I heard her voice, which now sounded much more demanding. Mom couldn't believe that I just don't understand, because I'm doing so well now. Her voice became harsh, almost offended, as she added, "We're your parents, we've sacrificed everything for you. The least you can do is make sure we have a decent car." This was not just a request, but a real ultimatum, where my long efforts to help were taken for granted. Nevertheless, I still continued to prepare for their holiday. The Lum Zone was exactly the place where they loved to hold important events, with crystal chandeliers and white tablecloths, perfect for showing off to their surroundings. I had prepared a gift that they didn't even know about, and I was ready to act out the last scene of this performance. My heart was pounding with anticipation, despite the tension I was feeling due to the recent demand. The party was in full swing, and I immediately noticed them sitting at the table, Mom in a new dress that clearly cost a lot, with a slight hint of a recent car purchase, despite everything that was around. "Mom, I didn't," my hand froze, but she didn't let me finish. She interrupted me, standing up like a stone wall, her eyes full of rage. "How dare you come here after all we've done for you?" Her voice sounded so strong that I almost didn't recognize her. "Are you refusing to help your parents after we sacrificed everything for you?" She stepped forward, her words lashing me like cold rain. Dad joined her, his face red with anger. "We only asked for one thing, one simple thing, to make your mom happy for our anniversary," he almost screamed, his voice trembling with resentment. "But you're too selfish. Aren't you too busy counting your money to take care of your family?" I couldn't believe my ears. The room began to spin slightly, and the air in it seemed to become heavy as lead. I tried to swallow the words, but they wouldn't come. "Is this how you raised your daughter?" one of their friends asked, clearly enjoying the drama. "How can you be so disrespectful to your parents?" His words made me gag. Mom turned to me sharply. "She's not my daughter," she declared, as if the words had been forcibly torn from her. "A real daughter would do that, buy us a car, and not come here empty-handed to ruin our holiday." As if in response to her latest attack, my hands were shaking. I picked up the envelope, cringing so as not to show how much I was touched by her contempt. Everything I wanted to say took my breath away, but I could. I pulled an envelope out of my pocket and stood up to look at them all. My hands were shaking as I tore it in half. I couldn't contain my emotions, but my face was calm, almost cold. I spoke, and my voice was clear, even, and strong. "Do you want to know why I didn't buy you that car?" I felt the tension heating up to the limit. Mom, her face now distorted with anger, snapped her fingers, interrupting me. "Just go away," her words broke through like a thunderclap. "You're going to embarrass us in front of our friends." She turned around to squeeze out the last drop of energy for her reputation, her eyes searching for support in every familiar look. I looked around the room, those smug people, my sister, who didn't dare look me in the eye, my parents, who looked much more concerned about their reputation than anything else. Then something in my chest clicked like a chain, and I saw Aunt Kla standing in her place, in the center of the same room, many years ago, facing the same judgment, the same contempt, the same hypocritical smiles. I remembered how she stood when I was still a teenager, and what seemed impossible to me then, how her respect, her pride in me faced the same cruel world that was alien to any manifestation of humanity here in this room. I said, "I was building a house for you." I said that my voice is clear and even. A beautiful 5-bedroom house on a family plot, for everyone, for you, Dad, Emma, the kids. I waited until these words fit into their minds. "Today I'm going to surprise you." I saw the color drain from their faces, their eyes glazed over, Mom's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, but there was no surprise in her gaze. She couldn't understand what I meant. The moment I tore the envelope in half echoed in their silence. "The house is mine now. And my life too." I finished without looking back. "I'm not going to try to buy your love anymore." The words finally broke through that glass barrier, and I felt my insides fill with an emptiness that hadn't been there for a long time. But all this time I knew this moment would come. Mom, with her hypocrisy, with her expectations, couldn't be a part of who I became for a long time. She could no longer control my choices. I turned around without waiting for their answers and left. My footsteps echoed in the empty house like the last footprint in the sand.